divine image, the close reading, if you look at the title, the divine image, I looked up and researched from the Oxford Dictionary the definitions, and divine is described as like a god, or like devoted to God, a sacred image, and then or sacred, and then image is defined as representation of the external for a person or a thing in art, like a mental representation or idea, a person that closely resembles another, etc. So initially, right from the start, you already know that this is going to be a poem like in the image of God or resembling Him, which made me think of Jesus, like made in His image, or man created in God's image. All right. The speaker of the poem indicates that mercy, peace, and love were also created not only in God's image, or like a representation of God, but in man as well, because due to the fact, or the idea, the Christian ideology that man was created in the image of God.
Why they use these nouns specifically?
Yeah, to both encompass God and humans, yeah, as well. Like instead, because like God
make them
and humans,
almost like equality,
right?
And, like explain how like one relates to another in the divine image, which they do talk about human and God almost interchangeably in certain parts. So I feel like that is a good point.
Yeah, because usually there's like God and man are so separate, like they're in completely different realms, like heaven and earth.
Like one's a total hierarchy,
yeah,
and the other one's all below it.
Yeah, and then now this one's kind of like convoluting the two. So that was interesting.
Or at least making both divine. Both are divine.
Yeah, that's true. Going back to the title of the overall poem.
All right. So further down in the poem, the peace, love, mercy, and pity are like classified as virtues of delight that all pray to in distress and then like return their thankfulness. And I was kind of just looking at the sentence like, what is the cause of this mass distress for all? Pray to these virtues of delight. So yeah, like what is the cause of this mass distress, and how do the virtues enable an action that must be returned in thanks? Like what about praying to these makes one want to like return their thankfulness? It's never really stated in the poem, so I think it's something you're supposed to like.
I think as far as questioning what it is that is making people in distress, because this isn't a poem that's based in Innocence, right? It doesn't really make that explicit. And I think that there's a reason for that, because when you're in Innocence, you're not necessarily looking at the things that cause you in distress, but rather you're looking to the things, virtue, pity, peace, and love, that are going to make it better and return it in thankfulness. So I think it's kind of maybe on purpose that they don't make it explicit within the actual poem.
In the third stanza, the speaker states that mercy has a human heart, and mercy is like defined as a compassion or forgiveness towards others, that it's in your power to punish them, and the heart is typically equated to a place where like emotions dwell and that can be like physically felt. So that makes sense. And then pity is a human's face, and pity is a feeling of sorrow and compassion caused by suffering and misfortunes of others. So, and I think like with the human face, you can convey those emotions. If God is like encompassed by these virtues of delight, does God have a human face, or is pity only relating, like in this sense, to a human? Is pity in a human face, and then this is also related to God?
Well, I almost think that they're trying to say that like God doesn't see pity on people in some ways. I could be wrong about that, but the idea of pity is almost like it's not necessarily feeling compassion towards somebody. It's almost more like of a sarcastic remark. In some ways, you feel pity on somebody instead of I feel like I feel for them, you know. And so I think that pity is sometimes used as an excuse, and so I don't think that they put that in relation to like. I guess that's where that separation I think comes in place, because I think that the others again are kind of more in relation to like a religious value, and pity is more of a human feeling that can be related, I guess, again in different ways than one that's actual sorrow or etc.
Yeah.
But then there's also the second stanza which says that these qualities are in God too.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you think about like paintings and stuff of God, usually he has like a human form.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not like an apricot or tree or something. So
This is true. So I guess he is a human, like in some ways of describing it, as is everybody else, or at least was. I guess you could say.
And I think it's less trying to tell us what God is, and it's more trying to show how we relate to God. We put this human face on God because that's what we see. And in a way, like I said again, they kind of equate to both being divine. And so the way we think about God more in our minds rather than actually what God is.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't ever actually say that. Right.
Woo!
Image.
Killing it.
All right. So continuing on with that, love is the human form divine, which is the human body. And I kind of thought of this as like an indication that love can be felt and conveyed like physically. And then peace is the human dress, kind of like a garment that like envelops humans, which I thought was the oddest one, possibly an indication to like covering like nakedness underneath, and like peace provides like protection and a sense of like well-being. So towards the end, like what I got from this, it means that every man has these virtues, like signified by the all, and even of every clime. I think that's in like the third, the fourth stanza, which is to me was like a background, religion, culture. Anyone that prays in moments of distress can relate back to this poem. It's not just specifically for Catholics; it's for anyone, which is confirmed by the speaker stating, "In heathen, Turk, or Jew."
I actually found that interesting coming from where this poem is written, and like you kind of look at all of this, and like sometimes people put such a label on like who God is and who's allowed to like be religious towards God, that sometimes they exclude other religious groups. And so to bring that together almost relates back to that human idea, because humans come from different backgrounds and humans come from different religions. And so it's not just saying that, like, you know, the way I believe is the only people who can have this divine image. Everybody can. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, very like inclusive.
That's that innocence thing though too coming in.
Yeah.
From kind of my research, I guess, in that sometimes when people have had experience in life, they kind of, that's why they seclude certain groups of
like
people.
Draw
because,
differences.
Because they develop almost like cliches about different groups of people, and so with this innocence outlook on it, it's still that they still think that everybody's equal, which everybody is, but it's the idea that people develop these stereotypes and stuff as they go on in life.
I think that even with when you're thinking about the divine, if you're thinking about God, people often with experience will go away from religion or turn away from God, because then they start to realize that these things are not necessarily good things.
Question. So in the last stanza, in the final couplet, speaker says, "Where mercy, love, and pity dwell," and I thought it was interesting that peace was omitted from this, because throughout the whole poem, like it's been 4 items, and now it's only 3. And I was thinking, like, could this be due to the fact that like wars are waged over like religious differences, and Blake is writing a poem about like human conditions that affect everyone, no matter where they're from, like what they believe. I was just curious why peace wasn't in the last couplet.
That's interesting.
Well, going back to the third stanza, like just going off of what the poem says, I mean, the human form ends with love, and then peace is just like an outside dress.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that in the last stanza, he's just saying the things that are inside the human form.
That make up the human
That
form.
dwell.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Totally. All right.
So, in other words, stuff like from the Bible, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy," and "giving to the needy," he takes those things apart. And by doing so, he makes it clear that just because you show pity or mercy, it doesn't automatically make you a good person. And we kind of saw this in Blake's other poems, like Holy Thursday. And like, for example, you can't really show pity to someone who isn't somehow worse off than you are. And all in all, basically, the first stanza kind of shows this inequality that has to exist in order for these supposedly good virtues to exist. second stanza, he kind of continues with this, like, the whole mutual fear brings peace, and both sides in the beginning are afraid that they'll end up in hell. Like, if they don't show pity, then they'll go to hell, or if they don't show mercy, they won't go to hell. But, well, for example, the merciful continue to show mercy, but if you, like, get rid of, like, people to feel pity for. So another thing I wanted to point out was that from this stanza on, you have, like, a third person perspective instead of the first person perspective in the beginning. So what do you guys think of that?
I think it just means, like, kind of like when you say, like, you know, like the male reference in most things, like, I think it's just the same idea. And it's a very sexist point of looking at it, but also I think this poem was written a while ago, so that really issue wasn't addressed yet. So I just think that he means, like,
generally it's like everyone?
The general population, I guess, would be my guess. But I could be wrong, and it could be more inclusive. I just don't know. That would be my guess.
I just thought that it was cruelty, since you have it on, then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits his hair. So.
Oh, so it's naming cruelty. It's almost like putting a face to it.
And it's a he.
And it's a he.
I think another way to look at it could be like, in the beginning, he kind of encompasses, like, it's we, it's all of us, including the speaker. And in the end, by saying he instead of we, he's kind of separating himself from this former line of thinking. Like, you know, before we did this, this, and this, and then now he's actually seeing it from a different perspective. He did this instead of including me. So it could be from his experience or whatever. He's changing the way he's looking at it now.
So then, another thing about cruelty is, why do you think cruelty is, like, laying these traps? Like, he knits a snare and spreading his baits his hair. But what's he trying to catch?
Innocence?
Or trap?
Well, yeah, maybe innocence, like someone naive enough to, like, fall for the trap and, like, not have the experience to, like, know what to look for, too. This is a lot darker than the divine image, which seems so, like, inclusive and everyone feels this.
And then, if you go on, then you have humility taking its root underneath his foot. Like, what does it mean for, like, humility to come up under, or actually take root under the foot of cruelty?
If humility is, like, physically underneath it, but I think it's easier to be cruel than it is to be humble.
But using the word root, though, too, rooting underneath, means maybe that cruelty starts in humility. And because normally the root of something is where something comes out of. Like if you think of a tree, obviously, then it's like basically where it starts.
Yeah.
And then it's what's enveloped from that.
Yeah.
So it could be.
Could we go back to connecting this to the, because I think I kind of talked about this too in my section, kind of connecting it back to, in Innocence, we think that these things are virtues and that they're maybe inherently good, but then as we gain experience, we start realizing that maybe they have more sinister intentions.
Depth.
Yeah.
And so by
Or
its
depth
roots
of
being,
humility.
by its roots being based in humility, but it grows into this tree that actually bears fruits of cruelty, right?
Yeah. Moving on, then you have this tree of mystery, and this is something I was stuck on for the longest time because I was like, what does it mean by mystery? So I looked it up in the dictionary, and one of the definitions I found is that mystery can be a sacrament of the Christian church. So sacraments are religious ceremonies or acts that are considered to be an outward and visible sign of inward and spiritual grace. So kind of like the acts of showing mercy and pity from the first stanza. The fruits of deceit that this tree produces are considered ruddy and sweet. And I thought, well, that's kind of like how it feels good to show pity for someone or be merciful.
But almost deceit, though, too, can be like two-facedness, and that's why it says ready and sweet to eat. Because even though it's fruit of deceit, it's like kind of a bad thing, it's still sweet to eat it. So it's kind of like a pleasurable / bad thing, and so it's, again, that idea of experience, because without experience, you don't know that people can have two sides to them,
Right.
a sweet and a not so sweet side.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back into thinking about the nature of these things, or the kind of like the reasons behind doing these things. So it's sweet to the person or whatever, but the intention is
Deceit.
deceit. Yeah, there you go. So maybe the
I gotcha.
intention behind it.
Yeah.
And kind of tied to that, you have the caterpillar and the fly.
Mm-hmm.
So one definition I found of caterpillar, which is like super old, but it used to be a word which meant like extortioners or someone who preys upon society. And then as for flies, we know what flies do. They kind of buzz around
Yeah.
and stuff.
They eat fruit, though.
Yeah. The two of them feeding upon like good virtue and good deeds are kind of like taking advantage of it. So it's kind of two-facing the
Nice.
And then also this tree. So finally we have that this tree doesn't exist anywhere in nature because, well, both the gods of the earth and the sea are looking for it, but they couldn't find it. And then the speaker concludes by saying that everything comes from the human brain, which happens to be where the speaker's views are coming from too. Like, he's thinking about these things and he comes to these conclusions, which are really cynical and whatnot. But anyway, what do you guys think?
I think it's cool that we talk about this tree so much throughout this entire poem. And then just to like, I thought the image was really powerful about it grows in one's brain, because like really, like we don't have a tree in our brain, but the idea that these experiences throughout our life like kind of create this tree for us that we have to base off of everything that we've learned, and we have to learn to be smarter than other humankind, because in order to like venture for ourselves. We'll just take turns.
All right, so a question. I think I'll just start with posing questions since we already went over commentary for the two different. A question I wanted to look at where is the balance of power compared to the first one and the second one, the one in Innocence and Experience. More specifically, when he talks about in the end, how we talked about in the end of the one in Experience, how he says that this divine image could be for all, and we talked about the inclusiveness of that statement. And in the second one, it's saying that these virtues exist, but they only exist because there's some kind of disparity between people. So if you guys have any thoughts on maybe the balance of power between the two and what that has to say about Innocence and Experience as far as that goes.
Children don't really like judge it, like it's so fine, and then you can see adults reacting to things that their children didn't in a very negative way. So there's something about Experience that kind of like breeds and like brings out rooted and subtle things that we don't think of when we're younger. So I'm always just so curious about like what happens between those two times that makes Experience a lot like darker and cynical.
Yeah, right.
Well, when you're a kid, you don't really think about, oh, hey, I'm different from everyone else somehow. But as you grow older, you realize, oh, hey, this person does things slightly differently than I do. Why
High
is
school.
that?
Right.
So kind of going off of that, there's a lot in the first that kind of blames instances that happen in life, like distress, on kind of almost like fate rather than on consequence and reaction. Whereas in the second one, it talks about people being poor and being unhappy, but it's all relating to like a human fault for the most part. So what do you think is the, like, do you see this difference, I guess, in that, you know, one is, do you think that Innocence refers to fate, or is it something else? And do you think that Experience refers to, like, more of taking responsibility, or do you think that there's, like, a crossover there that's not right, or et cetera? What do you think about that?
I think that in Experience, he definitely doesn't provide solutions. Like, he is saying that all of these things are happening, and
They're bad.
they're not only are they bad, but we see that they're bad, and in a way to kind of like pacify ourselves or whatever. Then we like give into pity, and he calls it selfish loves, right?
Yeah.
And in the first one is just like unthinking, just love, and all of these things, you know, encompass love and stuff. So I lost my train of thought.
Almost like an unreachable thing, though. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, almost like it takes over as opposed to like what we can actually control.
Mm-hmm.
And they just like, I think that when you don't have that experience in life, you just think that like everything happens because it happens, and there's no reason for it, there's no rhyme for it, it just happens, and what the result from it is always this happy result, because you don't have to worry about a lot when you're still in this innocence phase. When you get into experience, you have to realize that all these actions that you take in life have consequences, and nothing or not everything is all roses and butterflies and all that good stuff. So I think that's really important. So did you have?
Okay, cool, yeah. Well, we actually have touched on a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, but we could definitely say, what kind of a narrative do you think that, like, setting up here, if in the first one we're saying that the human image is like the ideal human image, right? And then there's God, and then he's equating them both to, they're both divine, and in the first one we should be like giving our thankfulness to them. And then in the second one, he's saying that these things aren't necessarily coming from a good place. So what is he saying then about maybe Christianity, or is he saying something about God specifically, or divinity, or what kind of a narrative would you guys think that he's setting up here?
In relation to God, like God was brought up a lot more in the Innocence poem, and he's encompassed by the virtues of delight, and that I think cruelty and these other more like miserable attributes stem from humans and like the human mind,
Right.
that it's not something that we're initially created with, but that it grows like over time and from our environments or experience. But initially, when we are first created like by God, we are born good and then we're corrupted.
Right.
Kind of
Well,
like our first point. Actually.
That's kind of like going back. Okay, so sorry, I have to like tie these things in because they're all relating right now.
Right.
But
Exactly.
so like, do you think then that it's easier for children to believe in religion than it is for adults?
Yeah.
And do you come to a point in your life where you're almost unable to like pray about everything and everything gets better, or is that something that is always just something you have to find within yourself? Like, where is the line drawn where religion is something humans are capable of?
I think that even in experience, he's not necessarily setting up an anti-religious or anti-God narrative. He's simply saying that, in Innocence, we took all of these things to be virtuous and to be good. And with experience, we start realizing that some of these things that we set up as our basis or as our foundation aren't necessarily yielding the types of fruits that we initially intended them to.
Yeah.
And then there's people who take advantage of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point as well.
So.
I do think it's very interesting though, like the use of words and I guess like mercy and pity and all those kind of things, and very similar throughout both poems, but they're used so differently, and I think that that's the key to the Innocence and experience throughout all what we've talked about, is the fact that there's so many similarities, but again, there's so many differences in the way that they're portrayed. And so I think that there's a lot of ideas we can take in life that begin in innocence and end in experience that change and develop over that time and over that adventure, I guess. Interesting.
Yay.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yay, guys.
Bye.